Look this morning at around half or so of the qualities or the traits that Paul recorded in 1 Timothy chapter 3, but our emphasis was not really on the subject that he was looking at. He mentioned these traits as being those which belong to those who are prepared and continuing to do the work of an elder, an overseer, a pastor. But we were looking at those in the context of someone who is a parent. And noticing that because those who are overseers are men who have ruled their house well, then everything that he said there, or the majority of it, has to do with ruling the house well. And so since parents would have the same goal in their work to rule their house well, we're looking at these traits and characteristics from the standpoint of parents. Parents, whether you be a parent of the past, present, future, or someone encouraging parents by the songs that you lead, by the example that you set. We all work together in all of these ways. And so we looked at 1 Timothy chapter 3, really just the first 2 verses and not even all of that, that the traits of elders ought to be the traits of parents. Blameless, having one spouse, being temperate or watchful, sober-minded, clear-thinking in how we assess ourselves and then our family, of good behavior, respectable behavior. We noticed even the word modest means orderly, and so that's the message here. The goal of a parent should be to be of orderly behavior, and then hospitable. We notice that's not bonus points for elders. That's the expectation of all Christians. And there's some unique blessings that come to children when their parents establish the habit of hospitality. So we'll pick up in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2. Traits of elders, for the majority of these, should be the goals at least, if not the standard and the practice of parents. The next that we find at the end of verse 2 is that an elder is to be apt to teach, or able or capable of teaching. In my 20 years or so of preaching, this seems to be one of those that becomes the most controversial when men are being considered for elders, as people have different assessments of, well, are they really able to teach? And what I've come to see in this verse is the simplicity of what he says. He doesn't say they've got to be able to teach publicly and privately. They've got to be able to teach a 45-minute Bible class, and they've got to be able to deliver a 3-point outline. He doesn't say it with all that degree of specificity. He just says that they have to be someone of whom everyone can agree they are able to teach. When they teach and their method of teaching, whether it's public or more comfortable in a private setting, all of that isn't specified. It just says that they're able to teach, and then that implies that they do what they're able to do. And so that can be done in a variety of ways. But we're thinking about what is the role for parents. Well, of course, one of the works of a parent is to teach. Does that mean he or she has to teach publicly in front of the whole family 3 times a week? Or to one individual? Well, it doesn't give all that degree of specificity, but just think about every parent becomes a better teacher by virtue of being a parent. The fact is, every parent knows things that their children don't know, and things that their children need to learn, and they need to learn those things from their parents. There are some things that you can kind of outsource. There's some things that parents you can say, well, it doesn't matter who they learn it from. As long as they learn it from somebody, then that's good enough. But parents also, I hope we realize, there are some things they might learn from others, but that they must learn from you. It's different when it comes from you. And so if you know those things, and you know your children need to know those things or need to know them better, then I don't care if it's a 3-point outline, I don't care if it's written or if it's oral, but somehow you've got to be able to teach. And I think most parents know that. And I think most parents, consistent with their own abilities, then they figure out a way to teach. And many times the way that a mother teaches is different than the way that a father teaches, but they're both teaching the same thing. There may even be things that as a parent you realize, I don't know this, or I don't know it very well, but I want my children to know it. And so we learn it so that we're able to teach it. So this is a process even for parents. We learn so that we're able to teach. And again, the methods that we do that and exactly how we do that may be different from person to person, but the bottom line is the same. We teach. And in the process of teaching, we learn about the subject, of course. Anybody who's taught a Bible class or any teaching in any area knows the teacher ends up learning the most because of the time and thought they have to put in the process of preparation. But also as parents teach, they also learn more about their children. Of course, the process of teaching and of working together, you learn more about the one that you're teaching. And so parents, by teaching, learn more about the children's strengths, learn more about their weaknesses, learn more about their interests, learn more about their talents, learn more about the differences between their children. Now, some of that happens by observation, I understand, but some of it happens by the process of the interaction involved in teaching. One reason some of this can't be outsourced, some things can, but one reason parents need to be the ones teaching their children is because you, as a parent, have the most vested interest in your children. You are most interested in their success more than anyone else. And so parents, and maybe not because of the pleasure of teaching or the personal enjoyment of teaching, maybe a parent doesn't even think they really have that great of a talent of teaching, but just because of their devotion and their love for their children, they figure out a way to do it. And sometimes that may mean addressing all of the children at once. Sometimes that means, child, step into my bedroom. We need to have a teaching session. The teaching happens in a variety of formats. And again, consistent with the abilities of each individual, that may differ in some ways. But I can just hardly imagine, maybe it's possible somewhere, but it's just hard to imagine that there isn't a parent who over the course of parenting becomes able to teach. And while, again, the context of 1 Timothy 3 is talking about men able to teach so they can oversee and lead in the work of the church, go over a few pages to 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 8. We probably all know this, but it's worth being reminded that though a woman cannot be an overseer of the church, mothers and grandmothers are essential teachers and can make a deep impression, sometimes even more so than the fathers and grandfathers. In 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, I may have said verse 8, but in verse 5, Paul writing to Timothy and said that he was filled with joy when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which first dwelt in your grandmother, Lois, and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also. Now, I don't know what kind of education Lois or Eunice had, but it's clear, it's obvious, they knew how to teach. They at least knew how to teach their son, their grandson, and as a result of that, there was another evangelist ready to do the work of evangelist, ready to work alongside an apostle who had been threatened and had been near death for doing that work. And Timothy didn't have any. Timothy did not shrink back from going with him. Part of that was because he had a mother and a grandmother who held themselves to the same standard that an elder was, able to teach. I'll go back to 1 Timothy chapter 3, and we begin now verse 3. First thing he says there, not given to wine. And so that's proper, that's appropriate, that's right. That's got to be the trait of someone who is an elder. They have to have mastered that, and this has to be their condition. The New American Standard here says not addicted to wine. So when you bring up the concept of addicted, what would be the opposite of addiction? Well, the opposite of addiction is control, self-control. Addiction is someone who is out of control. It might not be constant, but there become points in which they don't have any other choice but to fulfill some particular desire, and at that point, they've lost control. And so the instruction not given to wine is emphasizing self-control, because really, as a Christian, we can't be given to anything. There can't be anything that owns us, that oversees us, that takes control of us, that demands us, and we just say, well, I just have to do it because of some internal desire. In everything, we have to have mastery. We are to have self-control. But what are the things that people become most addicted to? Especially at the time that Paul's writing, it's the drug known as alcohol. That's, of course, the connection to wine here. And even what he said previously, to be temperate or to be watchful, well, that would contribute to not being given or addicted to wine. Being sober or sober-minded or clear thinking. Of course, alcohol has the exact opposite of being clear thinking. And so all of that would contribute to this, but he just says it plainly this way: not given to wine, not addicted to wine. Now, this statement causes some people to ask the question, well, does that mean they can drink wine as long as they aren't addicted to wine? And that could be a fair question. How would you answer that? If someone asked you, well, this says not given to wine, but if I can drink wine without being given to wine, then is that what this passage would allow? Well, maybe your answer would be passages like Ephesians chapter 5, verse 18. And we might answer that question with this question. This passage says not given to wine. What if someone says, well, I can be drunk with wine, but without being addicted to it? Is that allowed? Well, we might say at first it seems, okay, maybe this passage doesn't address the drunkenness part. He just focuses on the addiction part. Well, by saying not given to wine, does that mean you can do anything with wine as long as you're not addicted to it? Well, I think the way we would answer that is, well, let me just show you another verse that doesn't specify the addicted part, but that says something about the being drunk part. And there Paul just says plainly, do not be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. So how drunk can I be? That's where our society often abuses the word, and their idea of drunk is, well, as long as I can walk a straight line, then I'm probably not drunk. And then now they're using man's definition of that in order to define the word. But Ephesians 5:18, the word drunk was there before there was the blood alcohol limit set by an American government. When he says do not be drunk with wine, that excludes drunk to any level, to any degree. Now, our society kind of plays with words and says, well, I was just a little bit tipsy, just a little lightheaded, but I wasn't drunk. Well, whatever you're calling that, you're intoxicated. And that's what the Bible forbids as a whole. So, back to 1 Timothy 3, whether it's for an elder, or whether it's for a parent, or whether it's for anyone, the instruction here in these passages do not give permission to drink intoxicating beverages, because the result is intoxication. That's what they're made to do. The simple point here for parents would be you're to be apt to teach. You don't want to be the one who introduces your child to the habit of drinking or to the practice of drinking on a regular or an irregular basis. In fact, just the opposite. Be apt to show and to teach your children the blessings of life without wine, without alcohol, without being deceived by that, because wine is a mocker. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 1. Back to 1 Timothy chapter 3, I want to combine a couple of statements. 1 Timothy 3, verse 3, not given to wine, not violent, and then skip ahead in that verse and find not quarrelsome. And so let's just put those together because of a similar nature. Not violent, which, again, the New American Standard says pugnacious. I had to look that word up. I haven't think you used that word over the course of the past year or years. But pugnacious means to be quick to argue, quick to quarrel, quick to fight. And so if we put not violent with not quarrelsome. So I don't think violence would be limited to punching somebody with a fist, but heated arguments. And so someone who's ready to do the work of an elder is not violent and not quarrelsome. But then what about parents? Think about that. Again, the idea here is self-control, and control over my anger. We remember that passage, be angry and do not sin. So we can be frustrated, we can be angry without being violent. We can be frustrated even with our spouse or with our children without being quarrelsome. Sometimes that just means biting our tongue and letting it go. And I'm not satisfied with something, but I just leave it at that because I don't satisfy everyone in every way myself. Not violent, not quarrelsome. The work of an elder certainly involves not quarreling, but willing to correct. Well, when is a correction needed and when is it not needed? When can the problem just be let go and it doesn't have to be addressed because it's not something of the nature that needs to be directly addressed? Well, where does an elder get that kind of discernment? Well, for one, the Bible does that. In Romans chapter 14, there's a description of things where he says, don't judge one another. Either way someone might behave or believe or decide, they're both equally acceptable to God. And so an elder has to know the difference. But where does he learn to have some of that discernment about when to really dig in his heels and not compromise, and then when to let some things go? Well, he develops that ability in the home. He develops that in the home. Turn to the book of Proverbs. Let's read a few verses there. First, Proverbs chapter 15. A man who rules his house well and a mother who rules her house well develops the ability to not be violent, to not push the matter, to not be quarrelsome, even as they lead their children and have full ability to push any discussion as is needed. Proverbs 15, verse 1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So there can be wrath and harsh words in the workplace or in any place. But when there are harsh words in the home, well, then the easy response is to return with a word that's a little bit harsher, and then reply to that with a word that's a little bit harsher. And then what happens? The temperature continues to rise. For parents, not violent, not quick to quarrel, and not quarrelsome. How do I avoid that? Proverbs says a gentle tongue. And then as my children see from me, a gentle tongue, even when their tongue is not so gentle. When children see from parents a soft answer, that helps to turn away wrath. Look at Proverbs 25. Proverbs 25 and verse 15. Parents who are not violent and not quarrelsome are teaching and showing their children things like this. By long forbearance, a ruler is persuaded, and a gentle tongue breaks a bone. Now, this is an interesting proverb. How do you change somebody's mind? Well, it's not by putting your fist to their cheek, but it's by patience combined with a gentle tongue. Patience combined with a gentle tongue. That's how you can change the mind of a ruler. And so here, children should see that in their parents, and parents can even tell their children, if you want to change my mind about something, you be patient, you use a gentle tongue, and sometimes a child might even change the decision of their parents. I can think of some occasions in my youth that were like that. And then one more, Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 28. Proverbs 25 and verse 28. Whoever has no rule over his spirit is like a city broken down without walls. Whoever has no control over his spirit is violent, is quick to argue, quick to quarrel, is quarrelsome. And parents, your children will be quick to argue and quick to quarrel and quick to start a fight. How do you lead them? How do you lead your children? Not violent, not quarrelsome. And then the next statement, back to 1 Timothy chapter 3, because this only tells us what not to do. Okay, if I don't do those things, then what should I do? I'll go back to 1 Timothy chapter 3. And I jumped around a little bit within this verse. 1 Timothy chapter 3, not violent. And then we're going to skip over not greedy for money and come back to that in a moment. Not violent, and we picked up not quarrelsome, but what? It just gives one word in contrast, but gentle. Go over to James chapter 3. Let's think about the trait of gentleness. Maybe it's obvious why you need that as a man who would be an elder would need that. Let's think about gentleness in the home. James chapter 3 and verse 17. Let's go back to verse 16, where envy and self-seeking exist. Confusion and every evil thing are there. That fits along with the violence and quarrelsome. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. There's a lot there. But here is the characteristics of someone who has ruled or who rules his house well. Every house has conflict. Every house that's full of more than one person has more than one idea. What happens when those ideas clash? Gentleness. That's the wisdom, he says, that is from above. Go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Notice how Paul described his work among the church in Thessalonica. He gives two illustrations to describe his conduct among them. And he chooses the role of both a father and a mother, not saying that he was their father. But notice just how he describes himself as a teacher. First of all, in verse 7. He says, "But we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children." I've always thought this was interesting, that a man would say, "My conduct among you was like a nursing mother." And all he means by that is the gentleness with which he treated them when he came to them. And then also look at verses 10 and 11. He says, "You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe, as you know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father does his own children." I just think this is interesting. He says, I was like a mother in some ways to you. I was like a father in some ways to you. And that doesn't mean, Paul isn't saying, and if you know anything about the teaching or the writing of Paul, he wasn't gentle with every word. But his point is he started there. He started with gentleness, the gentleness of a nursing mother, and even the gentleness of a father. When he says in verse 11, he comforted them. I don't think there's any other way to comfort than to comfort gently, right? If you're not comforting gently, is it really comforting? Now, there was a place for charging, and that can involve some stronger words, and Paul was willing to do that. And certainly in parenting, not every situation necessitates gentleness. But what we notice here is that even someone who's going to lead as an elder, the rule is, his reputation is, he's able to be gentle. Now, when a situation requires more, he's able to do that, but he's always able to start with gentle. He has the characteristic, he has the reputation. Here is someone who is able to be gentle, especially on those occasions where others are tempted to be violent and quarrelsome. And so fathers and mothers is gentle. One of the words that your children would use of you, and they might be right, they might be wrong. What about your self-assessment? Is gentle one of the ways that you would describe yourself? Not the only way. Gentleness in the absence of other things is a problem, but is it among those traits? Well, let's go back to 1 Timothy chapter 3 and finish up verse 3. Again, here I'm going to combine a couple of traits that are mentioned. At the beginning of verse 3, he mentions not greedy for money. And then at the end of verse 3, not covetous. There may be some distinction between these two, but I think it's just slight. And so because of the overlap, let's just consider them together. We talked about self-control in regards to addiction to wine, and that would apply to any kind of substance, of course. Our society is very creative with that. But now we find that self-control has to be present in a completely different area. Self-control in regards to our response to money and to possessions. So self-control, in other words, avoiding the constant desire for more. Avoiding the constant desire for more. Parents, think seriously about your possessions, your goals, the way you use your time, and the way that you plan to use your time. Because your view of money and of possessions, you're setting the standard. You're setting what's normal for your children, no matter how abnormal it may be to the world. You're setting the tone, and you're writing the approach into the hearts of your children concerning money. Now, what they'll do with that in the future, of course, you can't control, but you're setting the standard. And so let this be the standard in our homes. We're not greedy, and we're not covetous. Now, what does that look like? Go over to chapter 6 in 1 Timothy, and in verses 6 through 10, Paul describes both sides of this. What someone looks like who is not greedy and who is covetous, and what someone looks like who is not greedy and not covetous. So first of all, verses 6 through 8. As I read, again, Paul's writing generally, but put it in the context of our study. Think about, what do children see in parents who fit this description? When children see parents where godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out, and having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. What do children see in parents who have these qualities? Well, for one, children see contentment, and children even get reminders of those things that are obvious. How many times, parents, did you tell your children something and they say, well, I already knew that? Well, if they already knew that, good, you were doing your job. And so that they continue to know that, you don't mind giving them reminders, do you? And here's one of those reminders. Children who have parents who view godliness with contentment as great gain, they remind their children, we brought nothing into this world, and we will take nothing out of this world. And so that's just not the focus of our time and our priorities and our plans. Does that mean we have to go live on a mountain and we can only eat once every 10 days? No, the next verse, verse 8 says, if we have food and we have clothing, with these we shall be content. Here he summarizes the goal. This should be the goal of our work, to provide for our needs. And then other verses would tell us to provide for the needs of others. And if we can make a distinction between the things that we need and the things that we want, that will go a long way to teaching our children this idea of contentment with what we're given. Again, he doesn't say, well, you can only have food and only have clothing, and you've got to give everything else away. Jesus said something like that once to the rich young ruler. But that's not what Paul says here. That's not what is instructed of all Christians. Whether I have more or I have less, I'm content with what I have. What do children see from parents who have this quality? And then now look at verses 9 and 10. Think about, what do children see in parents who have the opposite quality, who are greedy and covetous? Verses 9 and 10. Just for the sake of application, I'm just going to throw in parents as I read, not, of course, trying to change what is written, but just to help us see the application. So verse 9, but those parents who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown parents in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some parents have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. What do children learn from parents who desire to be rich? And again, notice, the problem is not whether they are rich. They might be rich, but that just isn't their focus and their drive. And they might not be rich. And being rich, accomplishing that is not their focus and is not their drive. What do children see in that? But when that is the focus and when that is the drive of parents, what the children see is all kinds of evil. That could be things like gambling and stealing, but that could also be things like complaining. When children hear complaining from their parents, it could be things like jealousy or just constant conversation about what we don't have and what we're going to get next. And it's always a focus on what we're chasing next. And then that ends up infringing upon conversation and plans and focus on other people and who we could help next and how we're going to grow. I mean, it's just turns what Jesus said on its head. It's more blessed to give than to receive, is what Jesus said. But then this mindset is it's more blessed to receive than it is to give. Then these parents are susceptible to temptation and a snare. He talks about foolish and harmful desires. That doesn't even have to be things that are sinful. There can be foolish desires that aren't sinful. But in Matthew 13, verse 22, when Jesus taught the parable of the sower and the thorny soil, he talks about pleasures and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches. And what Paul says is people are drawn into those desires, and he says they're drowned. That's an appropriate metaphor or example here. They desire to have more, and that desire just becomes a flood. They get covered up with more. And he says even some stray from the faith, and they're pierced through by sorrows. And I think in the context of parents, one of those sorrows must be, I set an example for my children. I planted the seeds of greed and covetousness in their heart, and so they grow up and they're not content, and parents were the one who lit that fire. And so we need elders who are not greedy and who are not covetous, but what they did is came from a home that they led that was absent in those things. All right, back a few pages to 1 Timothy chapter 3, and we'll finish our study in verse 4. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4. One who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. What are the traits of someone who rules their family well? He says, having his children in submission, and then this is important, having children in submission with all reverence. Because think about the difference in someone submitting and someone submitting in all reverence. You see the difference? Now, certainly one way for someone to be unable to rule their own house, someone who loses control of their house, who loses the submission of those under them, is someone who destroys reverence. How do you destroy the respect? How do you destroy the reverence of those whom you lead? Well, one of the most common ways is hypocrisy, right? When a leader is known to be a hypocrite, some people might submit to him, they just don't respect him. But of course, when we think about nations, often there are revolts and there's revolutions when we're not going to submit anymore to this kind of a leader because we don't have any reverence, we don't have any respect for that kind of a leader. Well, in a home, of course, that's devastating. So some parents lose the respect of children because of hypocrisy, and they lose submission. And then sometimes leaders try to get it back. They try to get submission, and maybe even they gain it simply by threats of maybe violence of different kinds. Do you remember Rehoboam, the son of Solomon? When he became king, the people made a request, well, your father made taxes really high. Would you lower our taxes? And do you remember his answer? He said, my pinky is going to be like my father's waist. What was large for my father is going to be small for me. And so he answered them with a heavy hand, basically with a threat. And you might remember that's when the kingdom went from the united to the divided kingdom. He lost the submission of some because of an answer like that. But in contrast to that, think about, how does God receive submission with all reverence? How does God accomplish the submission of His creation with all reverence? That's a long list. I couldn't capture all of it. But one way that God instills reverence is He tells us the truth. He always tells us the truth. He tells us about the past. Don't we revere God because of what we know about Him and because of what He tells us about the past? He doesn't tell us everything, but He tells us the most important history lessons that we need to learn. And as we know more about God and the past, we revere Him. God tells us of His love. God gives us good gifts, and so we revere Him. But it isn't all wrapping paper and ribbons. God gives warnings, and God follows up those warnings with punishments. God also makes other promises, and God keeps His promises. And God shows His power and shows His wisdom, but He doesn't only display His power to push us into submission. There's an aspect of showing His power to humble us, but He shows us His power so that we'll follow Him, so that we will revere Him. But God never forces anyone's submission, does He? He doesn't force anyone to love Him, even those who are made in His image, and even those who belong to Him. God doesn't force His own children who began to love Him to continue to love Him. What God does is rule His family, rule His house, to lead us to submission with reverence. And so, if you can agree that God rules His house well, then learn from Him how to rule your house well. Learn from Him how to lead others in submission, but don't put a period there. They're going to submit to me. Well, learn how to lead them in submission with all reverence. And that's not easy. And it's also not easy because that doesn't guarantee that your children will love you. It doesn't guarantee your children will love each other. It doesn't even guarantee that your children will love God. If you rule your house well and you do everything to lead your children to submission with reverence, there's no guarantee that they're going to follow. It only guarantees that you will rule your house well, and that God will see that, and that God will be pleased. And as a parent, what higher standard or better standard can you set than I want God to be pleased with the way that I lead my home? God intends for there to be godly leaders for the church, but godly leaders of the church are first godly leaders of the home. And really, whether or not you're going to be an overseer in that sense, an elder, a pastor, if you desire if you desire to rule your family well, then learn from what the Holy Spirit says here about those who lead their home well. Turn your songbooks to number 303. When we think about leadership, of course, our mind ought to go back to the shepherd. Is the Lord your shepherd? He wants to be. He wants you to join Him and to follow Him, though He's over you, whether you accept Him or not. If there's anyone here tonight that knows the Lord is not your shepherd because you've been running the other way, then we simply want to remind you that Jesus offers to bring you into His flock and His fold and His love and His care. And if you know that Jesus is the Christ and of the things that he has said and taught, and that you've done the opposite, but you're ready to repent of those things and to confess your faith in all that he offers, if you're willing to be baptized, he'll begin keeping his promises that day, this day, if that's the day for you. If as a Christian, we can help and encourage you in returning to the Good Shepherd, we offer what we have, and we remind you of what Jesus has and offers as we stand and sing.